I just wanted to mention a quick word about the host of our webinar series, disasterready.org. I think many of you on the line today are already familiar with Disaster Ready, but for those of you who are not, it's a new free online training resource developed by the Cornerstone OnDemand Foundation, specifically for use by humanitarians, those interested in disaster preparedness and disaster response. If you've not already visited the portal, please feel free to try it out. It requires only a one-time registration, which takes a minute or two, and thereafter you can access everything and anything on the portal, including dozens of e-learning courses and other training resources that are relevant to preparedness and response. Next slide, please, Janet. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our sponsors. These logos that you see here are agencies that have been extremely helpful to Disaster Ready as it's been designed and rolled out really since the spring of this year. So again, our thanks to these groups for their assistance. Next slide, please. So we're really, I think, honored today to be co-hosting this webinar with INEE. And for those of you who are not familiar with INEE, I think it's fair to say INEE has been one of the most successful interagency initiatives in the humanitarian sector. And certainly within or over the last 10 to 15 years, they've done a truly remarkable job in elevating the profile of education in emergencies. And as well, I think it's fair to say that the current time is a very appropriate one to reflect on INEE's accomplishments and also the lessons that have been learned and are in the field, given the tremendous displacement that we're seeing in and around Syria, the massive numbers of individuals, but more so families and children. So in many respects, I think Syria, the size of that emergency and also the ambiguity of how long it may last, really represents an excellent example of the importance of focusing on education during emergencies. So with that, again, I'd just like to welcome our three presenters, Arianna, Sweta, and Caroline. Thank you all for being here with us today. I'm going to stop talking now, and Arianna, I believe you're starting off for us, so the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, George and Jeanette, and to Disaster Ready for hosting this event. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share information and to start a conversation with you all about education and emergencies and the minimum standards. So first, I would like to begin by sharing an outline of what we'll be discussing over the next hour. So first, I'll provide a background on INEE, on education and emergencies, and some background on the development and content of the minimum standards. And then Sweta and Caroline will share their experiences using the minimum standards within Plan International and UNICEF's education work. They'll be specifically touching on usage related to contingency planning, program design, assessment, fundraising, advocacy, and capacity development. So there will be a lot to cover. But by the end of the webinar, we hope that you all have an understanding of the minimum standards and also some ideas on how they can be applied in the field. So we also hope to provide enough time at the end to respond to any questions that you may have regarding education and emergencies or the minimum standards or the work of any of our organizations. So you can be thinking of those as we move along. So first, just a little background on INEE for those of you who are unfamiliar. INEE, which stands for the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, was founded by a number of UN agencies and NGOs in the year 2000 when education was not considered a priority in humanitarian response. And the goal of the network was to ensure the right to education for all, even in crisis situations, and to support quality in education policy and programming. Since then, INEE has grown into a network of over 10,000 members in 170 countries. And our membership is really diverse and consists of a wide range of stakeholders from the education, development, humanitarian sectors, from UN agencies, ministries of education, NGOs, also parents, teachers, members of affected populations, working together around these goals to share knowledge related to education and emergencies and advocate for the inclusion of education and emergencies as a key humanitarian response, and also to support capacity development and quality in programs and policies. So that education is a human right is a guiding principle of INEE and is reflected in our overall approach and within the minimum standards and the other tools that have been developed by INEE. So just very briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar with this field, education in emergency is not just about literacy and numeracy, but can be both life-saving and life-sustaining. So by life-sustaining, we mean that education can offer critical hope, support, and stability for children and youth in very difficult situations. Education can also help build critical skills that a generation will need for a country's future stability, such as conflict resolution, peace building, critical thinking, and questioning skills. Education can also save lives by providing physical protection. Safe learning spaces can reduce the risk of being sexually or economically exploited or recruited by the armed forces. Education can also save lives by sharing key life-saving information like landmine safety, HIV/AIDS, and also reduce maternal mortality. So we know that young women that stay in school longer on average have children later, which reduces maternal mortality. So it's clear that quality education can be powerfully transformative in positive ways, but it's also important to acknowledge that education systems that are poorly designed and implemented can be quite damaging, which brings us to the INEE Minimum Standards, which were developed to ensure the right to quality education. So the creation of the minimum standards was prioritized by early members of the network who felt that there was a real need for a global tool that would articulate a common framework for quality education. Organizations felt that they weren't speaking the same language, that there were a lot of good practices that weren't being captured, and if they were captured, they may not be shared within or between different types of institutions. So the education and humanitarian community came together around this mission. The content of the handbook was developed through a highly consultative process involving over 3,500 educationalists from over 52 countries. So the reason that these standards carry so much weight is because they represent the lessons learned, collective thinking, and rights of the global community. The standards are also rights-based, based on international legal frameworks that deal with the right to education, some of which are articulated on this slide. And finally, the minimum standards are now companion standards to the widely used Sphere humanitarian standards, which is really an acknowledgement that education is an integral part of humanitarian response alongside the other sectors. So through a large-scale assessment of the minimum standards that was carried out in 2012, we know that the standards, which are now available in 28 languages, have been or are being used in 110 countries worldwide. The top 6 ways that the standards are used are listed on this slide, but I think I'll let Sweta and Caroline share more information on the various ways that minimum standards can support quality education response and provide color on the usage piece. And instead, I want to briefly share a bit about the organization and content of the standards. I am not going to talk through each of the standards. This would take us quite some time, but just provide a brief overview of the framework of the standards. So the standards are organized into 5 domains. You see in that circle document the 4 that you see in the inner circle, plus the foundational standards, which are depicted around the outside of the circle. These standards are meant to be applied across all domains to promote a holistic quality education response. So the foundational standards include coordination, analysis, and community participation. So these standards provide guidance so that education response is based on a sound initial assessment and is followed by appropriate actions and continued monitoring and evaluation. they share guidance around community participation, that community members are adequately involved in all phases of the project cycle, and then also that all work is carried out in coordination with all relevant stakeholders. So again, what this image is trying to express is that the standards are applicable across the other domains. So for example, the importance of including community in decisions around teacher recruitment or curriculum development. So while some standards may seem like general good practice when there are many organizations working in the field, the standards help create a common starting point and get organizations on the same page regarding established legal rights and obligations of humanitarian agencies and other partners. So just moving on from the foundational standards, the next set of standards is access and learning environment, which deals with equitable access to safe and relevant learning opportunities. The teaching and learning domain deals with the critical element that promotes effective teaching and learning within the classroom. So INEE has also developed an additional guidance note on teaching and learning, which shares additional good practice in meeting these standards. The teachers and other education personnel standards cover administration and management of human resources in the field of education. And finally, the education policy domain focuses on policy development and its enactment, so both the planning and the implementation pieces. And just to note that 11 cross-cutting issues have been mainstreamed throughout the standards, including conflict sensitivity, disaster risk reduction, gender, psychosocial support, and a number of others, so that to ensure that these issues have been integrated into all of the guidance. So at this point, I think I'd like to pass it over to Sweta, who will share Plan International's experiences using these standards in their work.
Great. Thank you, Arianna, and to colleagues at Disaster Ready, and to all of you for joining us today. As Arianna mentioned, she gave a brief kind of overview of what the INEE is and what the standards are, and we aren't going to go into depth, but I will talk to you today a bit about the usage of the standards. So I will review both kind of general ways that the minimum standards have been used and how Plan has been involved in that, and then specific examples from our work as well. So those of you who have worked in humanitarian settings know that there are generally 3 types of assessments that are done. And an assessment, as you know, is really the first thing that you would want to do before you would start any sort of programming, so you can get a sense of what the actual needs on the ground are and what would be the most relevant intervention. So these types of assessments are generally the multi-sectoral, where education would be part of it, but it may not necessarily be conducted by education people, or there might be an education representative on the team, but it could be, in many countries, it could be the Red Cross or another kind of local group or government group that leads the initial rescue and assessment stuff. And that's usually conducted within the first 72 hours. And then the education sector would generally, in approximately 2 weeks, it depends on the type of emergency. So it could be within 2-3 days. It just depends on how severe or not severe the actual situation is. If there is an education cluster or if it's just an education coordination group, these actors would then go in to conduct an assessment. And then and after this assessment is conducted, that's when you would really develop your response plan. And then you would also have ongoing assessments, because as you know, situations change and are very fluid, and so that means that your response also has to be agile, and you have to be able to tweak it and change it accordingly. So one of the ways that we've used the minimum standards, and this is not just Plan, but I know other agencies as well, is when you look at the multi-sectoral, we've used the minimum standards as a sort of advocacy to OCHA and to other kind of generalist groups to ensure that there are some key questions on education that are included in that first assessment. Often they're going to be looking at number of deaths, number of buildings destroyed, number of, things like that. And often the immediate thought is not to include questions on education. So the minimum standards have been really useful in terms of advocacy, in terms of really, pushing other actors to understand the importance of education, even during the first 72 hours or so of a humanitarian crisis. The minimum standards have also been used for the actual kind of overall education sector assessment, and the education cluster is developed through an interagency process, the Joint Education Needs Assessment, and that was very much kind of built around the key aspects of the standards as well. And then ongoing assessments. This is where you can kind of refer back to the minimum standards in your ongoing assessment. Let's say if you want to go back in 3 months to see if the situation is the same or if you need to kind of shift your response a little bit, you can go back to the minimum standards and say, okay, well, let's look at each of the domains and the standards, and are we reaching them? Are we, getting close to kind of reaching them, or are we working on them? In most cases, you probably won't be reaching them immediately or even at all, but you will be you'll be working towards them. And one way that Plan specifically has used the minimum standards for this ongoing education assessment is in Haiti. After the earthquake, we did a post-disaster needs assessment with UNDP and a number of different actors, and we were able to kind of use the foundational standards of participation, and particularly children and youth participation, active participation, as a way to actually get young people to lead this post-disaster needs assessment, because we figured if we're having programs for young people, they need to have a voice in it, and they need to be able to tell us really what the key needs that they have are. So we were able to use that as part of the post-disaster needs assessment that we led in Haiti with other partners. So moving on, and please, if you have questions, as George mentioned, just put them in the chat and we can answer them at the end. The next way that the minimum standards can be used, and Arianna referenced this previously in her slides, is the design of programs and fundraising, and proposal development. And I think this is an area that many agencies use the standards on a fairly regular basis. At least for Plan International, we use the minimum standards on a regular basis. So whenever we have proposals going out, well, let's say we've done the assessment and now we're doing a response plan. I would always encourage my colleagues to use the domains in the standards as a way to think about what types of responses you want in your education emergencies program. So they may go kind of by each domain to see, okay, well, are we addressing the issue of teachers? Are we addressing the issue of access and learning? Are we dealing with the issues of participation and community involvement? And it's been really used as a framework to guide our response plans. And then your response plan is what will then lead into your concept notes and your proposal development. So then that framework we've used to continue on and include it in our proposals. Now, often donors will have their own formats, so it may not actually on paper look like the standards. We wouldn't really write it as the standards, but we would use it to guide our thinking and our strategy. And likewise, we would then use the standards to also do advocacy when we're actually talking to donors about fundraising, particularly donors who may not be so keen on education. They may think that education should not be a first response, but we have been able to use the standards, the INEE Minimum Standards Handbook, to say, look, this is best practice. Because it is now a companion standards to SPHERE, we've been able to use that really to really push donors to think a bit more about education as well. Further, the minimum standards have been really important for us when we're doing our recruitment and staffing of education emergency staff. So in all of our job descriptions that go out, we have knowledge of and use of the minimum standards in there. And when we do interviewing, we will ask questions about a few of the standards just to see kind of what type of experience and knowledge people have, because if they don't have any knowledge of the minimum standards, then it's going to be very hard for them to do the type of implementation work that we want done on the ground. So moving on, then education emergency contingency planning and disaster preparedness process. So these are similar but different. One is an external interagency process, and one is the internal plan process. So I'll start with contingency planning, and those of you who've been involved with the cluster system know that especially in high-risk countries, the cluster will do a contingency plan for their sector. And this is where the various agencies come together. They will identify the most at-risk areas. They will identify in those particular areas what are the risks. Is it flooding? Is it tsunami? Is it earthquake? Is it conflict? And then once that's identified, we'll essentially put together a sort of plan of action, a contingency plan. So does that mean that, if this area is at risk of floods, what's our plan to make sure materials stay dry? Are we going to make sure we have additional materials at the field level? How are we going to do that? Different questions like that. How are we going to do recruitment? Are we going to have a roster to make sure that if a particular area is affected, then we can pull on other teachers and education staff to support that. So that is one example of where this worked really well with the minimum standards is I used to work in Nepal, and we actually in the cluster use the framework of the minimum standards to actually do our contingency planning, and it just really helped clarify people's thinking, and it helped us organize the plan very well. Now, the disaster preparedness process, that is something quite similar to the contingency plan, but it's something that Plan International does internally. So we will work with the various sectors to put together that contingency plan, but then we also need to make sure we are prepared with our staffing and our logistics and everything. So our disaster preparedness process would include education, but it would include other sectors as well. And this is our own kind of internal preparedness process, which would feed into a contingency plan. And I know UNICEF also has a similar process as well. So it's similar, but it will be really much more focused on internal. And then lastly, influencing government policy. The standards have been really useful. The standards, for those of you who have not looked at them in detail or have not looked at the handbook, they're quite general. And this is the first step really from the education emergencies community to start speaking the same language as Arianna said, and start using the same terminology and coming to some general agreements. However, it's not very specific. So it's very general, but you need more guidance at the field level. And so the minimum standards have been really useful in terms of getting governments on board to actually contextualize the standards really for their context and start using them. And one example, which I think Caroline might talk about a bit further, is in South Sudan. This process was done and with the government really actively involved in the process, along with the education cluster. And a number of other countries have also done the same thing, where they've actually developed national INEE minimum standards in a sense. So these are the South Sudan minimum standards. And what's been interesting is because the government has actually developed this and adopted this and is now committed to this. Of course, this is not something that happened very quickly. It took time. However, but with that, it's also influenced donors. So, for example, there was a recent call out from USAID specifically for South Sudan for education and education emergencies programming, and it specifically in the call for proposals specifically said that the partners would have to show, or the proposals would have to show how the South Sudan minimum standards would be implemented and used. So that's kind of a way of advocacy and how we've been able to influence government policy, which has then also resulted in influencing a donor, and in this case it was USAID. And we've had similar types of successes in other countries as well. Another example I want to share with you is in the Middle Eastern region in MENA. I did a training a number of years ago on education emergencies and the use of the INEE minimum standards, and there were a number of high-level representatives from the Ministry of Education there. And, you know, they said, okay, well, this is fine, but our country doesn't have an emergency. And if we did, you know, education is not a priority. And so this provided an opportunity, this training and kind of talking about the standards and how to use them provided an opportunity to get a conversation started. And by the end of the 5 days, I would say that a number of the ministers of education, the representatives, were thinking about it a little differently. Now, I don't know if all of them have contextualized the standards and if they're all using them and it's all part of policy, but it did open the door. It was a great way to advocate and get these governments to start thinking about this a bit more. Further, in addition to just kind of contextualizing the standards in its totality or using them totally, there are also ways that specific sections of the standards could actually influence government policy. So, for example, the section that Arianna talked about on teachers and other education personnel, you know, if there's, this could be used, you know, in a country to kind of push government to have a roster of teachers available to go from location to location. It could be used to advocate for changes in recruitment practices of teachers, so they're more inclusive practices. Those are just some examples, and there are a number of places where we have, based on the situation in that country, kind of picked at specific aspects of the standards and use that to really push government policy. So that, I hope, gives you a general sense of how the standards can be used. And now I'm going to hand it over to Caroline, who will talk a little bit about the UNICEF's experience.
Great. Thank you very much, Sweta. I see some questions coming through. There's a question about funding from Manan. I think that's a good question, and I think I will save that until the end. I think in education and emergencies, we always face the challenge of funding. Interestingly, I'm normally based in New York, but I'm in Beirut at the moment, working on the response here, and for the first time, maybe ever, we're actually in a situation where education is prioritized, which is interesting, and also interesting given Sweta's comment about the training and the ministers of education from across the region here in MENA, and insistence that there isn't an emergency, and B, that education isn't a priority, and just the reality is that situations do change. I also saw a question from Manan about a tool. I am going to speak to one, I am going to speak to one specific tool. So I wanted to talk to you, and between Arianna and Sweta, I think we have an excellent overview of the minimum standards and how they're used, and because ultimately the INEE is a convening group that, and we all sort of, in a lot of ways, we all see ourselves as kind of working under the umbrella, or under the auspices of the INEE in collaboration. So in many of the ways that PLAN uses the minimum standards is very much either linked or, quite frankly, identical to the ways that UNICEF would use them. And I've recently moved from Save the Children to UNICEF, and certainly at Save the Children would use the minimum standards in many of the ways that Sweta described. What I would like to focus on a little bit more is UNICEF's role as the co-lead of the global co-lead of the education cluster, and how we use the minimum standards as the global co-lead. In this first slide, this is a direct quote from a colleague of ours who is not a cluster coordinator but a sector coordinator, and she says that it's the INEE Minimum Standards is the only paper copy of an education in emergencies or cluster-related resource that she takes on any assignment. And one of the reasons for this is, while the clusters are kind of a coming together of different organizations, both UN and NGO, and also, as well as community-based organizations, the INEE Minimum Standards is seen to be obviously outside of those existing structures, and it's kind of a neutral. And so everybody can agree on a set of standards that were developed by bringing all of those players together toward the common goal of ensuring education for children reaches the agreed upon standards. So my colleague who said this she's based in Syria actually, and she said that it's a document that's certainly recognized by all of her colleagues, both within UNICEF and across other organizations. And she said, in terms of working with government and talking to government, it's a much easier sell because it's seen as a group effort as opposed to one agency pushing what is thought to be their own agenda. And I'm going to speak a little bit more to the experience in Syria and how the minimum standards are being used. And so what I have here is just a bit of an overview of how UNICEF incorporates the minimum standards in our work as the education cluster co-lead, and also in programs. And so as maybe I'll focus on the program side, I think a lot of them are similar to what Sweta mentioned in strategic program development. So looking at the programmatic approaches that UNICEF and partners take, and in terms of developing our own strategy for our education programs in our country offices. So quite often the strategies for our education team will be based on the minimum standards. It's a way that we can support capacity building, so capacity building and training, but also ongoing support to our colleagues in the field. It's a guidance for us to ensure that we're programming in a way that is integrated across sectors. So there's guidance in the minimum standards on how we link education in WASH and education in nutrition and education in protection. And the child protection sector has also now developed their own set of standards, and it certainly draws on the minimum standards for the way that is taken forward. We support the sector through the use of the INEE minimum standards, just to provide that guidance. Government advocacy is certainly a tool we use in government advocacy. I think Sweta provided a number of examples. Just earlier today, I was in conversation about the situation here in Lebanon. And Lebanon, prior to the Syrian crisis, had a student-teacher ratio that was about 15 to 1. And so the reality is now the schools here in Lebanon are attempting to, and it's becoming more and more of a challenge, but integrate Syrian students into the school. So we're continuing to use the minimum standards in this process to make sure that while ensuring that we're able to support both Syrian refugee and Lebanese students, that we're still maintaining a standard of education that ensures quality. Advocating to donors, I know that there's, in addition to USAID, I know that former CETA is Canadian CETA, is also a big advocate of seeing a good understanding of the minimum standards in programmatic approaches and how that is actually going to be applied in the field. And I mean, having come to that point, I think is a product of various organizations advocating to the donors to kind of recognize the importance of using the minimum standards. And finally, reporting. So reporting on the work that we're doing in accordance with the minimum standards. Under the education cluster, and I focus a little bit on this in the next couple of slides, again, looking at strategy development at the individual education clusters at the country levels, capacity building, which I'm going to touch on a bit, needs assessments, monitoring and evaluation. It's a guide for us to set up a monitoring framework and check that against the work that we're doing. Contextualization processes, which I'm going to speak to a little bit. Guidance working across clusters, similar to working across programmatic areas. Guidance in our appeals documents when we're putting together the consolidated appeal, or here in the MENA region, the Syria humanitarian response or the regional response plan, providing partners with a way to sort of organize our thinking and move forward in terms of how we submit to these common platforms, and advocacy to ensure that the work we're doing is in the direction of ensuring children enjoy the right to education, but also quality education in a protective environment. And I did pull out the one tool that Sweta already mentioned in terms of a specific tool that has been developed by the cluster in collaboration with cluster partners, focused on assessments, and that's the JENA, the Joint Education Needs Assessment Tool. And all of these tools can be found on humanitarianresponse.info and click on the education cluster. And other tools that were developed by the education cluster and partners, building on the minimum standards, or the cluster coordinator training. There's a cluster coordinator handbook with a specific chapter on the INEE minimum standards and how that is integral to your work as a cluster coordinator. And also the education in emergencies training. It was in an earlier iteration, it was called the frontline responders training, but it was revamped and to bring in the INEE minimum standards, and now it's the harmonized package. And the INEE minimum standards are mainstream throughout all of the various different modules, and that's the basic training package for providing education in emergencies on the ground, and that can be found both on humanitarianresponse.info as well as on the INEE website. I briefly mentioned the use of the minimum standards in Syria. Our colleague, the sector coordinator in Syria, has been using the minimum standards in a lot of ways as an advocacy tool, and to build the capacity of the partners to be able to shift a focus. Because Syria is a context where previously the education sector was led exclusively by the government, and the partners who are now cluster partners were previously not specifically engaged in programming. So bringing people around the table and kind of training partners up on an approach to education in emergencies and how education is an emergency response is key. And the minimum standards are also available in Arabic, so accessible to the partners. One of the key interventions in Syria is school clubs, after-school clubs for children to provide them with remedial education and catch-up classes. And there's a draft set of guidelines for those school clubs that is based on the INEE Minimum Standards. And specifically to speak to UNICEF's programming, UNICEF has I believe it's in the second year of a 4-year initiative. It's called Peace Building, Education, and Advocacy. It's a 14-country program, a partnership between UNICEF and the government of the Netherlands, looking at the intersect between education and peace building, with the goal of strengthening resilience, social cohesion, and human security in conflict-affected contexts. And the basis of the work, before even moving forward with a lot of the programs in the countries, is to do a conflict analysis. And UNICEF has partnered with the INEE to produce guidance on conflict sensitivity related to this, and how it can be monitored in all domains. I think these new tools around conflict sensitivity, there's a bit of a misnomer out there that a conflict sensitivity tool is something that you use in a conflict setting, but really it's a tool for prevention, and it's a tool for as much as it is a tool for response. So through the peace building program, we're looking at sort of all of the phases. So the peace building countries themselves are not sort of first phase humanitarian emergency countries, but they are countries where there are protracted type emergencies. So it's looking at addressing some of those underlying issues of conflict sensitivity using the INEE tools. And then finally, in terms of supporting the wider sector, and this is again linking to this idea in the peace building program, the former name of the minimum standards was to focus on education in emergencies, but it's also, we see that it's much broader than that, and there's lots of contexts where the minimum standards are applicable and appropriate, and frankly, the term emergencies means different things in a lot of different contexts where we work. And as Sweta mentioned, the South Sudan Education Cluster, together with the government of South Sudan, led a contextualization process of the minimum standards. And what happens with the contextualization process is it's sitting down with existing policies and procedures within the government, or sometimes helping to guide policies and procedures with the government. It's the development of those policies and procedures, because this process was undertaken not long after South Sudan's independence. So it really helps to steer the direction of the sector, to build capacity to respond to an emergency, but also more broadly, just the capacity of the government itself. And similar exercises have taken place in Sri Lanka, most recently in Somalia, in Vietnam, currently in translation in Lebanon, and in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, the contextualization process was something that was actually focused on, rather than focusing more broadly on the sector, focused specifically on the community-based education, which is one aspect of the education sector in Afghanistan. And there's been a lot of conversation in the chat. So I see one now that is specifically addressed to me, so I think I will answer a question. With regard to the draft guidelines for the after-school clubs in Syria, it's not available online yet. It's still in draft. But it's definitely something that we would want to make available through the INEE website when it is, because I think it's kind of an innovative use of the standards, going kind of recognizing where the standards are applicable beyond the classroom. So it's definitely something that will be available, and probably something that might be available through the education cluster when it's ready.
Great, Caroline. Thank you very much. That was really excellent. Thanks actually to all three of our panelists. We have a number of questions lined up, and I realize we're running a little late because we started a little late. So for those on the line who are willing to stay on just a few minutes past the top of the hour, we're gonna try to take as many of the questions as we can that have been submitted. So without further ado, let me throw the first one out there. And the first one, Sweta, is for you, and that is, could please clarify again how she uses the minimum standards internally for disaster preparedness?
Hello. Okay, sorry. Yes. So regarding that question about how we've used it internally, so we've actually, it's been a similar process to the way we supported the contingency planning process, but what we've done is in our disaster preparedness process, it's very much focused on our own staff and our own, stockpiles and our own logistics capacity and our own availability of funds that can kind of get materials going, and that would then feed into a contingency planning process. So every year we would revise the disaster preparedness process for every country. And the countries are on a slightly different schedule depending on when they started. But every year they would be looking at, okay, so if we're thinking that this area could be affected by this type of situation, what could plan's role be in that? And if plan is ready to kind of put forward to the other agencies for the contingency plan that, yes, we can do this, have we gotten ourselves ready to actually deliver on that? So if we're saying that we're going to be supporting with teacher training, then do we have all the materials in place? Are they already adapted to the particular context? Is it in the language that it needs to be in? Which staff do we have will be leading that process? So it's very much focused on our organization and how we can actually contribute to the interagency contingency planning process. And the standards have been good in terms of getting us to think about things that we may have forgotten. So I think that's kind of been the best use of it. I hope that answers the question.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. And the next question is actually a slightly long one, but I think a really, really appropriate one. So let me just bear with me a sec. It says, at times the centers or spaces created for children in emergencies are far better than the standards and spaces that the government is providing to learners under normal circumstances. So sometimes we face a lack of support from the government, and at times the biggest problem is that learners, after completing their time in our spaces, they don't end up going back to their local schools. Instead, they simply drop out. In that way, the project doesn't seem to really be sustainable, as the learners have become used to other standards not present in the government schools. How do you cope with this? How do you ensure proper coordination but also follow international standards? So I don't know which one of you wants to take that one on, but I think it's a really, really appropriate question.
So I'm happy to start it, and then if Caroline and Arianna want to add on, I think that is it's such an important question, and this is why, humanitarians should not be doing harm. And this is like some ways when you are establishing temporary learning spaces that are better than what the government has, you can have these kinds of challenges. And I would say from my experience, it's not just coordination with the government. Of course, you need to do coordination. But what I've seen work really well in my experience is actually, so if an official education cluster is established, we actually want to try to get the government to co-lead that cluster. And where we've seen the the Ministry of Education actually appoint a representative, a focal point, to actually co-lead the process. That has helped hugely in eliminating those kinds of problems, because then the government is there really in a decision-making role, and we aren't doing any, as humanitarian agencies, we aren't doing anything separate from the government. So if the conversation comes up after an assessment and you're developing a response plan as a cluster, then and if some agency says, okay, well, let's go and just establish temporary learning spaces, then the government can then, if they're involved and have that leadership role, can say, well, actually, in this location, we already have X number of schools that are standing. Rather than establishing new spaces, maybe we can work together to improve what's already there. And I think that's often a better solution, is really working with the government to improve what's there versus putting in some sort of parallel system. Now, the process of getting the government to take on that leadership is not easy at all. It takes a long time and lots of advocacy. But in countries where I've seen the government co-leading an education cluster or co-leading an education coordination group, it's worked significantly better. So that's kind of how I would kind of deal with that. As long as it's not just simple coordination we need to do with the government. They need to actually be in the driver's seat, ideally with UNICEF or Save the Children or whoever is leading the cluster. And where they're not, we need to work really, really hard in making sure that they are actively involved and that they have a particular focal point that's focused on the response. And in that process, it's a simple thing, having a focal point, but it takes so much time and so much advocacy to make that happen. But it's so crucial. So I don't know, Caroline or Arianna, if you want to add anything to that, but that's how I would handle it and how I have kind of dealt with that situation.
Yeah, Sweta, if I can just add, I think your answer was really, really helpful. The goal of education response should be to begin to build back better and to link an emergency response to longer-term development. So I think that the minimum standards would guide that, because the Ministry of Education, the government, is the primary group responsible for ensuring the right to education, to, as much as possible, empower them to take a lead. And as Sweta mentioned, there are just so many numerous challenges. But something that we're still working on, but I think it's a really important question, and
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. I think just the government is meant to be in the role of lead of the clusters, and to Arianna's point as well, I think that like all of these approaches, like good sound approaches to development, it's important to ask these questions before you get started. And I think working together with the government and making sure that the response is embedded within the existing structures, within the existing, and so the strategy for response, should there need to be one, should be very much linked to the wider education sector plan. And ideally, an education cluster would be sort of a group that sits under the education sector, focuses on addressing the needs in the event of an emergency, and then almost kind of collapsing back into the education group. So as both Sweta and Arianna said, and I think it's important to ask the question at the beginning, they should be happening in parallel. That's something that it's a very pertinent question to what we're dealing with right now in Lebanon, because we don't want to be providing services for the Syrians that are not being provided, or the Syrian refugees that are not being provided to the Lebanese. So we always have to be conscious of the work that we're doing and the potential impact.
Great. Thank you all for those responses. Very, very helpful. Again, we're at the top of the hour now, or the bottom of the hour, I should say, but we're going to hang on for another few minutes. We have some excellent questions lined up, so I hope you all can stay with us. The next question, actually two questions that are rather similar. First is, what is the future of the INEE minimum standards? What are the biggest challenges, and how will they be addressed? And the companion question is, the minimum standards are currently aligned with the EFA framework. Will the standards be revised when the post-2015 global framework for education is known? So Arianna, take the first crack at that, but what does the future look like for the minimum standards?
That's a really interesting question, and one I haven't been asked before. In terms of the EFA goals, I think, at this point, it's unclear what this framework will look like. But like all INEE projects and process and the development of the standards, any revision of the standards or any reflection on if there's a new gap or if there's a need to revise the standards or take them in a different way will be a widely consultative process that will involve the INEE membership identifying a gap or coming together to identify this need and guiding us in this direction. So I think it's from the perspective of the Secretariat, I wouldn't be able to say what the needs will be in the post-2015, the new EFA goals.
Hey, and Arianna, would you mind just telling us what the EFA is?
Yeah, so the Education for All goals are a series of education objectives that were aimed to ensure full access to quality education by 2015. It's looking more clear that these goals will not be met. There are 57 million children out of school right now, and 50% of them are in countries affected by conflict. So education in emergencies is a kind of a big need within these EFA goals. But as these goals expire, there's a conversation within the global community on what will happen next. So a new framework is in the process of being developed and will be shared after the goals expire in 2015. Okay,
great. Thank you for that. We've got two more questions that we're going to take, and then we're going to wrap up. The next question is, well, surprise, surprise, how can we raise funds for education in emergencies program? Said, donors are often not all that keen to fund education as it's not considered a priority in emergencies. So what kind of strategies or tactics can we use to promote greater attention and funding?
So I'm happy to take a first stab at that. That is an excellent question, but probably the most difficult thing for us to do. Education emergencies, many donors, you rightly say, are not actually prioritizing it, mostly because they don't really understand what education does. And so the INEE has an advocacy working group that's connected also to the Global Education Cluster, and we do have talking points. We've tried so many different kind of ways of presenting the various talking points. Some have worked, many have not. So we're constantly in a process of trying to revise that. One of the things that we see as a huge gap is that we need to do some more evidence-based research to kind of find out why education should be a part of first response. And a lot of donors want that evidence and are asking for it. And it's not enough for us to just say education is life-saving, education is life-sustaining. People want education. They want to see the hard evidence. So that is one thing that we're trying to work on. We have used media. I think the questions also said about media. We have used media for advocacy. I'm not sure, if it's resonated with kind of all donors. And this is such a difficult thing because often, even if we talk to a donor and they're convinced that education emergencies should be funded, sometimes it's an issue of kind of their own bureaucracy and the way their funds are set up. So if we're calling it an emergency, but their specific fund is set up in a certain way, then it's going to be very hard for them to even change that. So no matter kind of what advocacy we do, it's going to be incredibly hard for us to kind of access some of that money sometimes. That doesn't mean we don't try. We keep trying. But sometimes what we need to do is repackage it. So if we're talking about education and emergencies, let's say in the context of a conflict, you can reframe it as education and peace building, education, and if we're talking about kind of disaster risk reduction, rather than using the language emergency, even though we know that when we're talking about humanitarian responses, we're talking about kind of the before the actual acute stage, if it's like an earthquake or a flood, like the specific time when that calamity occurs, and then the recovery phase. So we have to be very savvy in the way we approach the donors, and it's very individualized. So you need to understand what are the particular donors' perspectives, what are the constraints that the staff, even if they have decisions over funding, even if they can make decisions over funding, there may be other things that are part of their fund or their own bureaucracy that they themselves cannot change either. So we need to understand what that is. And sometimes then we can go, if it's in a chronic crisis situation, you can go to another fund. It doesn't have to be kind of the emergency humanitarian fund, but it can be another fund that might be more open to education. So I know that I can fully kind of give you black and white answers because this is the biggest struggle that we have every day, and I'm sure Caroline may be able to talk to you about the challenges with the Syria situation, being in Lebanon now. But what the minimum standards, establishment of the standards of INEE has done is it has moved donors a bit because it has professionalized the field to a point where many donors are now able to kind of say, okay, yeah, education is important. So it's a slow process, and I'm not saying that, it's not easy at all. This is like the hardest thing to do. But there are ways that you can rework the activities that you want to provide in a way that speaks to that particular donor's language. And it's very individualized, and you have to really do your homework and research and figure out specifically where they're coming from, what their constraints are, where decision-making and power lie, and how you can then use that to get money. So I don't know if Caroline or Arianna want to add to that.
I would just point you in the direction of more information. The advocacy campaign and working group that Sweta was referring to is called Education Cannot Wait. And this advocacy campaign is linked to the UN Secretary General's Education First campaign. And one of the main goals of the Education Cannot Wait campaign is to increase the level of aid to education as a percentage of humanitarian aid, because this number is falling. So I would encourage you to look at the pages on the INEE website and look at some of the messaging, and also look at some of the videos on the INEE YouTube site, which can also be used for advocacy. But again, as Sweta mentioned, in terms of messaging, in terms of advocacy, there's still a huge amount of work to be done at many levels. So it's still a challenge.
I think just briefly, I'm very conscious of time. And Sweta and I work on a lot of these issues together, so she's absolutely covered all of the sort of challenges that we face in securing funding. And she did mention kind of repackaging. And one of the things that we do in education is show the links to other sectors as a way to get funding. So demonstrate the link between education and protection, between education and WASH, education and education and nutrition, and show how the school and education can be sort of a flashpoint for various different interventions. And as Sweta said, sometimes the packaging is very important in terms of how donors will respond.
That's excellent advice. Thank you, all three of you, for your responses to that question. We know that is an ongoing challenge, but I hope those on the line will find those bits of advice useful. So having said that, I think we are now well and truly out of our time. And so what I'd like to do is just wrap up here and just remind folks that a recording of this webinar will be available on the disasterready.org website within 2 days' time. And I would like to just again thank our presenters, Caroline, Sweta, and Arianna, and as well the INEE network for making today's discussion possible. We hope you've all enjoyed today's session. And as well, we look forward to seeing our next webinar, which will be taking place on the 20th of November. It's on information management, visualization, and mapping in a humanitarian crisis. And we'll hear from UNHCR experts on one of their case studies. So again, thank you all for attending, and presenters, thank you for making this discussion possible today. Wish everyone a good day. Take care.